Dividing by fractions 1. Before we go over dividing by fractions, let's go ahead and review division. Here we have the problem 6 divided by 2. What does this problem represent? There are many different ways of interpreting division, but the way I like to think of division is in terms of groups and objects. For example, I like to think of this 6 representing we have 6 objects, and I like to think of this 2 as we're sorting into 2 groups. So for me, this problem is telling me I have 6 objects and I want to equally sort into 2 groups. Let's go ahead and visualize what this means. Here we have our 6 objects, our 6 dots, and we're going to equally sort them into 2 groups. Here are our 2 groups. Here's group 1 and group 2. Now let's go and evenly split up these objects so that each group gets an even amount. What's the answer to this division problem? The answer to a division problem is how much is in one group. So in one of these groups, I see that I have 3 objects. So the answer to my division problem is 3. I have 3 objects in one group. Using this visual, let's go and see if we can interpret dividing by fractions. Problem 1. 6 divided by 1/2. The way I like to interpret this problem is, this 6 is telling me that we have 6 objects, and this 1/2 is telling me we're trying to sort into half of a group. We're sorting 6 objects into half of a group. So what does a half of a group mean? If this whole bubble represents a group, we're only going to fill in half of this group. So let's go and take our 6 objects and sort into half of this group. What's the answer to this division problem? We know that the answer to the division problem is how much is in one group. If we have 6 objects in half a group, how many would it take to fill up one whole group? By definition of a fraction, we know that 1/2 tells us that it takes 2 parts to make a whole. It takes 2 parts to make a whole. So the answer is it takes 12 objects to fill one whole group. 6 divided by 1/2 is 12. Problem 2. 4 divided by 1/3. What does this problem represent? This problem is telling us we have 4 objects, and this 1/3 is telling us we're sorting into 1/3 of a group. So given my whole group, I'm going to sort these objects into 1/3 of it. So let's go ahead and place these objects into 1/3 of a group. The answer to this division problem is still going to be how much is in one whole group. We know by definition of a fraction, 1/3 is telling us it takes 3 parts to make one whole group. So creating equal groups, I know that it takes 3 parts to make a whole. So I see it takes 12 objects to fill one whole group. Problem 3. 3 divided by 1/5. What does this problem represent? This 3 is telling us that we have 3 objects, and we're trying to sort into 1/5 of a group. So given one whole group, we're going to sort these objects into 1/5 of a group. So let's go ahead and sort these objects. We know that the answer to a division problem is going to be how much is inside one whole group. By definition of a fraction, 1/5 is telling me it takes 5 parts to make a whole. So creating 5 equal parts, I see it takes 15 objects to fill one whole group. Problem 4. 2 divided by 1/4. What does this problem represent? This problem tells me we have 2 objects, and we're going to evenly sort them into 1/4 of a group. So given my whole group, I'm going to place these objects into 1/4 of that group. So sorting our objects, the answer to the division problem will be how many will there be in one whole group? By definition of a fraction, we know that 1/4 is telling us it takes 4 parts to make a whole, creating 4 equal parts. I see it takes 8 objects to make one whole group. Let's review these problems and see if we can figure out a pattern. What's another way of representing 6 divided by 1/2? When I divide 6 by 1/2, This is telling me it takes 2 parts to make one whole group. I could rewrite this as 6 times 2 parts to make a whole equals 12 objects in one whole group. 6 times 2 equals 12. Reviewing problem 2, this 1/3 is telling me it takes 3 parts to make one whole group. So I could rewrite this as 4 times 3 parts equals 12 objects in the group. 4 times 3 equals 12. Reviewing problem 3, 1/5 is telling me it takes 5 parts to make one whole group. So I can rewrite this as 3 times 5 parts equals 15 in one group. 3 times 5 equals 15. And reviewing problem 4, this 1/4 is telling me it takes 4 parts to make one whole group. So I can rewrite this as 2 times 4 parts equals 8 objects in the group. 2 times 4 equals 8. One thing you may have noticed is that when we divide by a fraction, our answer ends up being bigger. The reason for that is when we sort into a fraction of a group, it always takes more parts to make a whole group, which is why when we divide by a fraction, our answer gets bigger. To summarize, dividing by fractions is equivalent to multiplying by the reciprocal. When I take 5 objects and sort them into 1/3 of a group, it's telling me it takes 3 parts to make one whole group. So I can rewrite 5 divided by 1/3 into 5 times 3 because it takes 3 parts to make one whole group.